In this episode, we move beyond the basic idea of risk and start looking at how a certified information systems auditor, CISA, candidate should think about more mature ways of judging uncertainty, exposure, and business harm. Many beginners hear the word advanced and assume they are about to face complicated math or highly technical models that only senior specialists can understand, but that is not really the point. Advanced methods simply help an organization look at risk with more discipline, more context, and more consistency than a quick guess or a casual conversation. They help people decide which problems matter most, which controls deserve attention, and where limited time and money should go first. As we move through this topic, keep one simple idea in mind. Risk assessment is not about predicting the future perfectly. It is about making better decisions with imperfect information, and that mindset is central to both strong auditing and strong security leadership. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is with the basic relationship among threat, vulnerability, impact, and risk, because advanced methods still rest on simple foundations. A threat is something that could cause harm, such as a cybercriminal, a careless insider, a power failure, or even a weak vendor process. A vulnerability is a weakness that gives the threat an opening, such as unpatched software, weak approval procedures, poor backup testing, or unclear access rights. Risk appears when the threat and the weakness connect in a way that could damage the organization, and that damage might involve lost revenue, broken trust, disrupted operations, legal exposure, or poor decision-making. Beginners sometimes treat risk as a technical issue only, but that creates confusion very quickly. A payroll system, a patient record platform, or an online sales site is important not because the server exists, but because the business depends on what that system allows people to do. Once that foundation is clear, it becomes easier to understand why organizations use more advanced assessment methods at all. In a small environment, a manager might be able to rank the top concerns from memory, but larger organizations face too many assets, too many dependencies, and too many possible failure paths for informal judgment alone. Different teams may describe the same issue in different ways, which means one department might call something critical while another treats it as routine. A more mature method creates shared language and repeatable criteria so that people are not arguing only from instinct, personality, or recent headlines. That consistency matters a great deal to an auditor because the auditor is not just asking whether risk was discussed. The auditor is asking whether management used a reasonable process, whether the results can be explained, and whether the assessment actually supports business priorities rather than simply producing an impressive-looking spreadsheet. One of the most common advanced approaches is still based on judgment, but it is structured judgment rather than guesswork. This is often called a qualitative assessment, and it uses categories such as low, medium, and high to express likelihood and impact. At first, that may sound basic, yet it becomes far more powerful when the organization defines what those words mean before scoring begins. Low impact might mean no meaningful disruption and little financial effect, while high impact might mean extended downtime, regulatory attention, or damage to customer trust. Likelihood also needs definition, because one team may think rare means once in 10 years while another thinks rare means unlikely this quarter. The strength of a mature qualitative method is that it turns vague labels into shared standards, allowing leaders to compare risks across departments without pretending the organization has exact numeric certainty where none really exists. Many organizations take the next step into what is sometimes called semi-quantitative scoring, which blends descriptive judgment with numbers. Instead of only saying low, medium, or high, a team may score likelihood on a scale from 1 to 5 and impact on a scale from 1 to 5, then combine the values to produce a relative ranking. This does not magically create precision, and that is an important caution for beginners to remember. A score of 16 is not automatically twice as dangerous as a score of 8 in any real-world sense, but the method can still help sort issues in a practical and repeatable way. The real value comes from the discipline around the score, not the score by itself. When criteria are defined clearly, when assumptions are documented, and when the scoring is reviewed by people who understand both technology and business operations, the output becomes a useful decision aid instead of a decorative heat map that looks scientific but explains very little. A more numerical method appears when organizations try to estimate expected loss in financial terms, and this is where students often encounter ideas such as single loss expectancy, SLE, annual rate of occurrence, ARO, and annualized loss expectancy, ALE. The names can sound intimidating, but the logic is simple. Estimate how much one harmful event would cost, estimate how often it may occur, and then combine those ideas to express expected yearly loss. If a particular outage could cost $200,000 each time and might happen once every 5 years, management can begin comparing that exposure to the cost of prevention or recovery improvements. The important lesson is not that the number will be perfectly correct, because it rarely will be. The important lesson is that quantitative thinking helps leaders discuss risk in business terms, and it gives auditors a way to examine whether the assumptions behind spending decisions are sensible, documented, and tied to real organizational conditions. Even with stronger methods, a risk assessment is only as useful as the information that feeds it, which is why asset understanding matters so much. Organizations often make poor decisions because they focus on obvious hardware or software while ignoring the process, data, dependency, or reputation value connected to those systems. A public website may seem less important than a financial database until someone realizes the website drives most customer sales, partner communication, or service access. An internal application may appear routine until payroll stops, invoices fail, or emergency scheduling breaks down. Advanced assessment methods force a broader view by asking what data is involved, who depends on it, what legal or regulatory obligations exist, how long the organization can tolerate disruption, and what downstream effects may appear if the system fails. From an audit perspective, that broader view is essential because a weak risk assessment often starts with an incomplete understanding of what the business actually values and what harm really looks like. Another major idea in advanced assessment is the difference between inherent risk and residual risk, because that distinction helps explain the real role of controls. Inherent risk is the level of exposure that exists before considering the effect of safeguards, while residual risk is what remains after those safeguards are in place and operating. This matters because management can be misled if it talks about controls without first understanding the size and nature of the original problem. A company that stores sensitive customer data in several connected systems may face high inherent risk even if it has decent monitoring, good authentication, and trained staff. Those controls may reduce the risk substantially, yet they may not reduce it enough to satisfy the organization's risk appetite or legal obligations. Auditors pay close attention here because a common weakness is management assuming that the mere presence of controls proves the remaining risk is acceptable, when in reality the controls may be incomplete, poorly designed, inconsistently applied, or not aligned to the most important threat paths. Scenario-based assessment is another practical method that helps beginners connect abstract risk scoring to real business consequences. Instead of speaking only in general terms, the organization describes a plausible event, the conditions that allow it to happen, the assets involved, and the likely chain of effects. Imagine a manufacturer that depends on a scheduling platform connected to suppliers, warehouse systems, and shipping information. A ransomware attack on that environment would not only affect files on one server, but could delay production, confuse inventory decisions, interrupt customer deliveries, and trigger contract penalties. By walking through the scenario carefully, leaders can estimate impact more realistically and identify where detection, response, recovery, and vendor coordination matter most. For auditors, scenario work is valuable because it reveals whether the organization truly understands cross-system dependencies or whether its risk ratings were assigned in isolation, without considering how one failure can spread into operations, finance, compliance, and customer confidence. It is also important to remember that risk changes over time, which means a strong assessment is not a one-time document created to satisfy policy and then forgotten. New systems are introduced, vendors change, mergers happen, regulations evolve, staff turnover affects process discipline, and attackers discover new ways to exploit old weaknesses. A risk assessment completed a year ago may still contain useful observations, but parts of it may already be stale if the business environment has shifted. Advanced methods account for this by using triggers for reassessment, such as major technology changes, significant incidents, audit findings, or strategic business moves. Some organizations also watch indicators that suggest exposure is increasing, such as repeated failed backups, rising privileged access counts, growing incident response times, or concentrations of unsupported software. From the audit side, the question is not whether management can predict every change. The real question is whether management has a process that notices meaningful change early enough to reassess risk before small warning signs become major failures. Consider a practical example involving a regional healthcare provider that stores patient data, schedules appointments, submits insurance claims, and supports clinical decisions through several connected applications. Management may initially rate the electronic record platform as high risk because it contains sensitive information, but a stronger assessment digs deeper into availability, integrity, and dependency issues. If the system becomes unavailable for several hours, patient care may slow down, manual workarounds may increase error rates, and billing delays may affect cash flow. If data integrity is compromised, clinicians could make decisions using incomplete or incorrect information, which introduces safety, legal, and reputational consequences that go far beyond the cost of system repair. A mature assessment would therefore examine not only confidentiality, but also recovery capability, vendor support arrangements, interface dependencies, staff training, and the realism of downtime procedures. An auditor reviewing this environment would want to see whether those factors were actually considered in the risk rating, rather than assuming that any system holding sensitive data can be evaluated with a simple one-line label. A second example can make the idea even clearer by shifting from a direct technical failure to a third-party risk situation. Imagine a company that moves its customer service platform to a cloud provider because the service promises scalability, easier updates, and lower infrastructure burden. At first glance, management may think risk has decreased because the provider appears more mature than the company's own internal team. An advanced assessment, however, asks different questions. What happens if the provider experiences a prolonged outage, changes service terms, mishandles logs, or relies on subcontractors the company has not evaluated well? It also asks whether the company understands its own responsibilities for identity management, data retention, configuration choices, and incident escalation. This is a valuable beginner lesson because outsourcing work does not outsource accountability. From an audit perspective, mature risk assessment around third parties should show documented due diligence, clear ownership, realistic contingency planning, and recognition that convenience can introduce concentration risk when too much business activity depends on one external service relationship. Beginners also need to understand the common mistakes that make risk assessments look formal while producing weak results. One mistake is confusing volume with quality by collecting a huge number of risks that are vague, duplicated, or disconnected from business impact. Another is scoring risks without clear criteria, which makes the final rankings depend more on who attended the meeting than on the facts of the situation. A third mistake is treating every control weakness as a separate top risk without stepping back to see whether several findings point to one larger governance or process problem. Sometimes organizations also focus so heavily on confidentiality that they underestimate integrity and availability, even when the business would be damaged more by inaccurate data or prolonged downtime than by data exposure alone. An auditor should be alert to all of these issues because the purpose of assessment is not to produce a long register. The purpose is to help management understand exposure, make better choices, and show that decisions were grounded in a coherent view of business reality. For a CISA learner, one of the most valuable habits is learning to evaluate the quality of a risk assessment process rather than becoming impressed by technical vocabulary or colorful charts. A mature process should define scope clearly, identify important assets and dependencies, involve the right stakeholders, use consistent criteria, document assumptions, and connect results to treatment decisions. It should also be understandable enough that someone reviewing it later can see why a risk received a certain rating and what evidence supported that judgment. When auditors examine risk assessment, they are not trying to replace management's decision-making role. But they do need to judge whether the method was reasonable, whether important factors were missed, and whether the results were used meaningfully in governance and control planning. That is why practical examples matter so much. They remind us that the real goal is not elegant theory, but dependable judgment that helps an organization protect operations, information, trust, and long-term business performance. As we close, the biggest takeaway is that advanced risk assessment methods are really tools for better thinking, not badges of sophistication. Whether an organization uses careful qualitative categories, scoring models, financial estimates, scenario analysis, or a blend of several approaches, the method only matters if it helps people understand what could go wrong and what that would mean for the business. Strong assessments consider assets, dependencies, controls, changing conditions, and real-world consequences instead of reducing everything to a shallow label. They also help auditors ask stronger questions about whether management's view of exposure is complete, consistent, and aligned with organizational priorities. When you study this topic for the CISA exam, keep returning to the same guiding principle. Risk assessment should make decisions clearer, not more confusing. If a method helps management focus resources intelligently and explain its reasoning with confidence, then it is doing the job it was meant to do.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.